welcome. Um, this is going to be kind of an interesting talk. Um, the show that's on at the Wadsworth is not going to be there until next June, but there is another show that's happening at the Whitney, and I'm going to cover a bit of that in this talk also. Um, So what's happening with this show is it is put together by a consortium, and I'm going to look at what the museums are that are actually putting this together. It is through actually a consortium of museums, the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, Columbia um, Museum, Mobile, Alabama, and the Wadsworth. So it's really a consortium mostly of Southern museums, along with the Wadsworth, which has a spectacular collection of Hudson River School and pieces from more of the Northeast, but it's a really interesting thing. It was put together by um, Art Bridges, which is the Walton Museum down in Arkansas. Um, so it's a survey of landscape painting, performance art, sculpture, craft related to various aspects of landscape and our ongoing interactive relationship to the earth. Um, as you can see from this array of images, it's not an array of purely pastoral images from the that we're familiar with as far as landscape is concerned. Um, some very interesting work. There's about 40 pieces in this show. The show that is opening next week or the week after at the Whitney has 180 pieces in it. No, 120 pieces in it. Um, so it's much broader than this show. Uh, I'm not quite clear about how they're going to organize it. According to what I've read, they're going to do it by kind of a category. Um, this show is very interesting, and I'll try and have some degree of chronological progression through it. But let's go. Okay. Unsettled landscape in American art celebrates the rich, complicated, and evolving topic of the landscape in American art, from its origin in the 19th century painting into contemporary art. The show highlights the unsettled or evolving conversations around landscape and its relationship to establishing cultural and national identity over the last 2 centuries. Following his trip to the Rocky Mountains in 1859, Albert Bierstadt returned to the Western United States in 1863 with his friend, the author Fitzhugh Ludlow. Both men were tremendously impressed with the splendor of the landscape. Bierstadt wrote of their trip that he had found the Garden of Eden. Bierstadt uh, effectively combined his studio training abroad and his facility for sketching outdoors successfully cultivating a market for Western pictures back east. He painted this small finished oil, um, probably the first of the subject in his studio, and after his trip to Yosemite, he created a 5 by 8 foot version of this piece. So you get the sense of scale on this thing. It's really, you know, appropriate for the subject. Um, okay, so I'm gonna hop over to something which is, I'm sure, not in the show, but I wanted to throw in Caspar David Friedrich at this point. Um, the German Romantic movement imbued landscape with symbolic meaning, um, placing the summit at the remote distance that evokes a tranquil, timeless realm. The notion of the sublime here is vast, awesome, and a bit terrifying. And this is something which the American Hudson River School painters kind of picked up on, that sense of awe, that sense of what they would call the spiritual in the landscape as a symbolic image. Um, move my okay. Um, The painting below was inspired by Church's second trip to South America in the spring of 1857. So one of the things that happened here is, oh yeah, there's one other thing I wanted to do here. I want to zoom in for a second on this Friedrich. Right in here, there are these two tiny figures on the top of that hill looking out over this thing. So it gives you some idea of, you know, this this sense of vastness, this sense of um, our being part of this gigantic functioning organism, a part of the universe. Okay, so Church sketched prolifically throughout his 9 week travel to Ecuador and made many watercolors and drawings that contain elements found in this work. Um, this painting was created in the studio in New York. It was publicly unveiled in New York on Broadway, believe it or not, uh, in April 27th, 1859. Subsequently moved to the gallery of the 10th Street Studio building, and it was lit from behind in a darkened chamber. The work caused a sensation, and uh, and 12 to 13,000 people paid 25 cents. That's a pretty big population for New York at that time in 1850s, for crying out loud. Um, Paid 25 cents a piece to file through, and he also would set this thing up with music and basically Andean weaving and things like that. Uh, he was quite a showman. Um, One of the reasons why he would be going to South America at this stage of the game is the Hudson River School and the kind of idealized version of the Hudson Valley was, um, by the 1800s, more or less, um, the old growth forests and all that in the Hudson Valley had been clear cut. It was totally inhabited, and a lot of what they were making up was really a kind of plea for um, preservation, which is kind of interesting. In fact, the Hudson River School was kind of the first ecological movement in the Hudson Valley. Um, so um, he would go to the Andes for that kind of wild, fresh uh, landscape. Again, the difference between Friedrich and Church um, is really kind of obvious. There's this kind of um, uh, cleanliness to the Friedrich and wild quality to the Church. Okay, here's another piece by Church. And this, this again, it's too refined to be an oil sketch. It wasn't done outdoors. It would have been back in the studio. Okay. And we go from the grandiose to the humble, from um, uh, the great outdoors to the intimate microcosm. Um, Fidelia Bridges, I'd never heard of her before exploring this thing, and she's just this one does these wonderful pieces. I again am gonna zoom in because it's well worth it. Um, Unfortunately, the digital stuff breaks this down a bit, but they're really wonderful, detailed, delicate. Um, and this is an oil painting, um, Still Life with Robin's Nest. And this over here is a watercolor and I believe gouache, um, because it's so opaque. This one over here, I believe, is also an oil, but I'm not 100% certain about that. It could be a gouache also. But what I wanted to show you was basically the fine detail. Um, and was um, she was very good at what she did, and in her lifetime, she received a lot of recognition for her work. She was part of the um, I can't remember what it's called, American Watercolor Society, um, and you see how well dressed she is with her umbrella and her rig all set up to go out and paint in the fields. And in actuality, from what I've read, that's how she was. She would always dress herself properly before she'd go out into the fields and paint. But just gorgeous pieces. And here's another one. Fidelia Bridges was an American artist of the late 19th century and one of the few women to have a successful career in that period. She was known for delicately detailed paintings that captured flowers, plants, birds, and their natural settings. although she began as an oil painter, she later gained reputation as an expert in watercolor painting. She was the only woman among a group of seven men, um, seven artists in the early years of the American Watercolor Society. Some of her work was published as illustrations in books and magazines on greeting cards. A posthumous exhibit of her work occurred in 1984 at the Whitney Museum, at the Whitney Museum's Reflections of Nature show. Oh, there's a couple of chats here. Yes, the flowers are whimsical, that's for sure. Very realistic, but also flowing. I mean, it's a it's a it's a tough one to pull off. I'm gonna actually go in for another run at the Zoom here. Um, the to get that much detail, but not get so preciously tight and overwork things. She was quite remarkable. So, all right, we're gonna regrettably move on. um, I don't know exactly who this was. I missed that. Oh, I meant, let's see. Yeah. Okay. So um, this is one of the Western artists. I'm not sure if it's Remington or who exactly painted this one, but I wanted to move here. Um, and there are these pieces in the show. I couldn't get images from everything that was in the show, but this is typical of that kind of Indian encampment theme that went on in the late 1800s. And we're moving from that to Georgia O'Keeffe. And this is a particularly light-filled and lightly handled O'Keeffe. Um, Gorgeous piece, wonderful color. Um, and this is a view that was across from, where she lived, where her studio was, and her home. So this is part of a whole series she did. There are probably mm, a dozen that I know of that feature this um, mountain and this view of the mountain in different aspects on different kinds of days. Beautiful piece, beautiful brushwork. Really different from many of O'Keeffe's works, which are wonderful but much more solidly painted. And this is very light filled and beautifully handled paint. Um, and we go from that to Marston Hartley. And Hartley, um, you know, when we look at this is kind of going from that uniquely elegant O'Keeffe to this almost cartoon-like Hartley. Uh, in fact, Hartley looked a lot at folk art for inspiration. That kind of direct, expressive punch is one of his hallmarks. So, here we have a very different approach to nature. Uh, and we go to from that to this hazy atmospheric piece. You almost feel like the dampness in the air, the smell of the musky odor of the swamp. Uh, and this is from the 1940s. I mean, it could almost be a Charles Birchfield. Um, and now we're going to hop um, to uh, William Christianberry, who um, really he grew up in the South, and really focused on these kind of derelict or dilapidated buildings that dot the countryside. Uh, really interesting. Um, Again, you know, what is the American landscape? What marks have we left on it? What do these mean to our culture? And this guy is a very interesting artist. And as a young man, William Christian Berry, uh, photographer, painter, sculptor, and teacher who drew inspiration from his childhood in Hale County, Alabama. Christian Berry focused extensively on architecture, abandoned structures, nature, and extensively studied the psychological effects of place and memory. He often traveled the back roads of the South with his father as a child. He studied painting at the University of Alabama, where he read James Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Christian Berry was moved when he realized that the tenant farmers in the Walker Evans photographs were people he remembered from growing up in Alabama. He returned to the places Evans photographs and took photographs, took his own pictures with a Brownie camera. Although Christian Berry created many different kinds of art, ranging from photographs to drawings to sculpture, his experiences growing up in the South served as the subject for most of his artwork. And look at this fabulous piece, this you know, metal and tempera on wood, um, fairly substantial size piece, 45 by 50 inches. Um, and it's in the Smithsonian collection. Wall construction with blue star, wood, metal, paper, paint, really inventive assemblage piece. I haven't actually tried looking at this closely, but it looks like there's buttons and things like that in there. Let's see what we've got here. Buttons, screws, wire. What the heck is that? That little ladder over there. Really interesting. Textural layering. And we'll move on to another Beverly Buchanan. Um, Again, grew up in the South, um, went to art school, but used the material from a lot of these kind of dilapidated houses to create sculptures. And this is also her one of her photographs. There's a whole series of these fabulous photographs of these shacks that she did. And again, you know, with something like this, you can really see that three of the museums that put this show together were from the South. That they're deeply, you know, rooted in that culture. They're fun and funky, but also really, you know, they have a social resonance to them. Okay. This artist was really fascinating. I mean, a lot of her work is performance art. Um, and then toward the end, you know, basically she died in 1985, but toward the latter part of her career, she was doing a lot more the sculpture pieces and installation pieces. Earlier on, she was doing a lot of, you know, actual physical presence. You can see that image uh, of her covered with flowers down on the bottom. Uh, so there's this ritualistic quality, this religious practice of Santeria from her native Cuba. Um, Cuban American performance artist, sculptor, painter, video artist, who is best known for her earth body artwork. She was considered one of the most influential Cuban American artists of the post um, World War II era. Born in Havana, Cuba, um, she left for the United States in 61. So, you know, there's this earth goddess um, quality to these pieces. Really interesting, you know. So, in the landscape of the landscape, okay, Benny Andrews. Um, this painting is called Trash. Um, Oil and mixed media collage on canvas, 120 by 336 inches. So it's 10 by 24 feet. Um, Andrew's commitments to activism and education deepened. He embarked on an ambitious years long series of monumental paintings, the Bicentennial series. The first of these symbols was 8 by 36 feet and was central to Andrew's first solo museum show at the Studio Museum in Harlem. The second, Trash, Andrews intended these sprawling allegorical works as a response to what he knew would be the omission of Black history and Black voices in the National Bicentennial Celebration. 1776, huh? Okay, interesting piece. His sense of humor in all this is a little sardonic, but I'm familiar with Benny Andrews' work. It's really hysterical stuff. Migration. Okay. So what has this got to do with the landscape? Okay. If you look at the piece, there are these bird-like shapes in it. It really is kind of, you know, this directional flow. These are bird-like shapes that, and on top of which it's a kind of implicit indigenous pattern. So the crossing back and forth between cultures, between the North and the South, between Mexico and America, um, that kind of bird-like, um, there are no borders. Okay. Since Rocher's first road trip from Oklahoma City to Los Angeles in 1956, the artist has continued to engage the images he has encountered along the roads of the Western United States. This iconic painting from the 1960s embodies Rocher's inspiration from his travels. So if you're at all familiar with his work, and they just had a show of his work at the Museum of Modern Art, they had a retrospective at MoMA. So, basically it's this crossover between pop art and the landscape. Uh, it's minimalist. It is dealing with what was hip at the time in the art world, but it's also a reflection of what he was seeing around him. Um, ah, Interesting approach to streetscape. Um, it took some thinking. I spent a bit of time looking at this painting and trying to figure out what was going on here. How, first off, how he did it, but yeah, the first response is yes. It's looking down on, I don't know, L.A. It's basically looking at the layout of a streetscape and that perspectival business that's going on in it. But how did he paint this thing? So I started thinking about, basically the first layer would be this splattery yellow stuff, and it's dominantly yellow in the distance, and goes with the red and blue. So it's the primary colors. Um, and then it comes down to blue in the foreground. So there's this tension where that yellow is popping forward, but it's furthest back because of all these perspective lines. Really interesting trick. Um, so he would have laid down this splattery yellow, um, and then um, and the red and the blue, but then they were taped off to create the linear elements that are in the thing, to create all this perspective stuff. And then he went over it with this black to create the depth and to create these really amazing linear elements. Very clever painting. Um, I believe his name is Tom McGrath. Um, Relatively young. I mean, he was born in 78. Okay. And again, in the landscape, um, Jacqueline Bishop is known for her paintings, drawings, and installations that explore the psychological connection between humans and non-humans. Um, Informed by the history of landscape painting and and traveling to fragile third world landscapes, have allowed her to compare this to the loss of her own fragile Louisiana landscape. So Bishop goes to these places. This is a photograph of her in the Amazon, out there doing sketches. Um, she doesn't do complete detailed pieces like the one on the left out there in nature. She's just gathering material out there, and one of the things she says is that she uses the water from wherever it is that she's landed. She's done this, throughout um, South America, Central America, um, Asia. I believe she's done some work in Africa, but I'm not sure about that. Um, but she comes back with these, you know, sketches from out there in nature and builds on the fantasy from that. Uh, I'm gonna I'm gonna close in on this one again. I'm gonna zoom in on this piece because there's a lot to see in here. They're beautiful, but they're a little on the weird side. I mean, you look inside the belly of the ram, and there's these rabbits, whatever that thing is with those antlers. Uh, and then down here, we've got this dead bird with these um, huh, cat-like creatures. I don't know what the heck they are, but really interesting and a bit on the ominous side. Endangered species. So interesting work. Um, and a fascinating weaving of the traditional and um, the contemporary of science and art. Uh, the ecological edge to this is really fascinating. Ah, and this is Dan Friday, who was is an indigenous, ah, God, um, from Washington State. Um, he he studied um, and apprenticed with Chihuly, worked for 10 or 20 years with Chihuly and other really well-known glass blowers, learning his craft. But he's come to create these pieces which hold meaning for him. So Aunt Fran's basket. So this piece is basically referencing a basket from from his childhood from an aunt and doing it in glass. Really interesting. He does a lot of um, uh, indigenous symbols in glass. Um, very beautiful work. I'm not 100% sure if this is his piece, though this is in the show. Um, I think it is his, but I'm not sure. So the show has been touring the other museums. It's already been at the Montgomery Museum and it's been at the Columbia Museum. It is at the Mobile Museum, Mobile, Alabama, until February 2nd of 2025. And then it's coming up to the Wadsworth. Okay. Jeffrey Gibson at the Venice Biennale. Um, his paintings, if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else, is at left. Um, and then give my life something extra at the right. So that's kind of in the middle there. Um, and then in the foreground, if there's no struggle, there's no progress, which is a citation from um, Frederick Douglass. Um, again, um, from indigenous background, Choctaw, I believe, and something else. I can't remember what else, but he's a mixed indigenous, um, and that in the end, the message of Gibson's art, everything is multifaceted. His over the top aesthetic is a joyful revolt against reductiveness of fixed categories and the pressure he felt both externally and internally to always show up on behalf of Native Americans. Um, so Gibson is a MacArthur Genius Award recipient. So, there's a lot to this. I'm gonna pull this up. Gibson, born in 72, is a multimedia artist based in Hudson, New York. Gibson's dynamic art practice explores a diverse cross section of influences, including Native um, American indigenous craft traditions, cultural narratives, symbols of power, history, personal identity, and contemporary social issues relevant to BIPOC and queer communities. Um, he uses textile, embroidery, uh, weaving, hand sewn fringe, beadwork, and other materials for his assemblage work. He's got quite a workshop. There's a lot of people that work with him doing a lot of the sewing of when he'll give out the design and all that and have them work it. So he bought a old schoolhouse up in Claverack. Okay. So we're now going to move on to shifting landscapes. And this is going to be starting November 1st at the Whitney. It explores how evolving political, ecological, and social issues motivate artists' representations of the world around them. While the art historical genre of landscape has long been associated with picturesque vistas and documentary accounts of place, the artworks gathered in this exhibition suggest a more expansive interpretation. The 120 works by more than 80 artists depict the effects of industrialization on the environment, grapple with the impact of geopolitical borders, give shape to imagined spaces as a way of destabilizing the concept of a natural world. Drawn from the Whitney's collection, this exhibition features works from the 1960s to the present. And I could only pull out so many pieces. I wasn't really clear about what exactly is in this show, though I pulled out some of the names and pulled out representations of some of those people that are supposed to be in this show. Of course, George O'Keeffe. Uh, this we can see as landscape, but some of the others are a little bit more of a stretch. Of course, this minimalist sculpture in the architectonic situation of New York City makes all the sense in the world to me. Uh, America is for dreamers too. Um, so again, implicit, cross-border, all that, but landscape, it may be in mind, but and then there's Alex Katz. I'll definitely grant you this is a landscape, um, and a beautiful one. Really interesting piece. It's a late Katz. Okay. This is a really interesting piece. This artist, she's from the Dominican Republic, came to the United States, and I'm going to close in on this because you can't really see much until you get close to it. So you kind of see the floral and design and pattern. Um, Interesting motif. And it's kind of like this beast-like uh mutant creature. Uh Kind of creepy, but beautiful also in its own mysterious, strange way. Big, 90 by 112. Okay. And this piece is really on the edge of creation, so I guess this really qualifies as landscape being created or destroyed. And the Basquiat, uh, I'll give you, I mean, it's Hollywood Africans. It's Hollywood. So that's implicit of landscape and New York. Okay. uh, it's a stretch, but they're fun to look at anyway. This one's a really interesting piece. It's heading in Lincoln Tunnel. This piece is oil on astroturf. So, it's painted on fake grass. It's like really an interesting piece in that respect. And we're coming to an end with these outsider cityscapes. Purvis Young is somebody who is really considered an outsider artist, um, but he did paint these assemblage pieces about the city and about our interaction with it. Um, so unsettled landscape in American art. Um, at the Wadsworth. That's going to be in June of 2025. And Shifting Landscapes, it's a big show. I mean, it's 180, 120 pieces. Um, there's sure to be some interesting stuff in there. Uh, and there is a podcast, a set of podcasts actually, that you can access through the Wadsworth um, website for this. And the first one is really an kind of an overview with the curators that put together the show. Um, and that I found it helpful, in understanding where they were coming from and what they were trying to do with the show. Uh, I have no idea what they're trying to do with the Whitney show, and I'll go see it and see what I think then. So if anybody has any questions, ask them now. But otherwise, in 2 weeks, what the heck are we doing? I'm gonna do the Lily Bliss show, The Birth of the Modern. Um, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the wonderful Cézannes that she contributed to the museum, and really her collection was one of the formative um, uh, collections in the Museum of Modern Art, kind of set the direction for it because she was very daring in what she collected. So there's more than 40 works in that show. And that show is opening November 17th. So this should be good timing for a talk on her and on that wonderful Cézanne still life that I'm gonna go into depth on. I guess I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. Have a great day.